hope everyone's having a great evening. I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas. My apologies, I haven't been able to do many videos. Where I'm at doesn't get a good cell phone signal. So the only way I can do videos is to drive somewhere. And so since I'm out and I've been thinking about this thing and I have a few thoughts on it, initial, random, not well put together thoughts. I figured I'd talk about it while it's a little bit fresh in my mind. Mark Lanigan's memoir, Mark Lanigan of the Screaming Trees, the group The Screaming Trees, I guess you could call them a grunge band. That's what they were called. Back when they were more popular, more well known. Um, I guess I'll start with this. I love that group. The first song I heard by them was on the single soundtrack, Nearly Lost You. That's the name of the song. I loved the song. I looked into the group after that, me and my friends at the time when I was, I don't know, a teenager. And I just loved it all. Their most popular album, Sweet Oblivion, pretty much every song is excellent. The best three albums they ever did, in my opinion, are Uncle Anastasia, Sweet Oblivion, and Dust. And those are in chronological order. The way I said them, they're their last three albums, I think. I don't remember if they did any albums after that. Um, so many good songs on all three of those albums. Sweet Oblivion's probably the best, that album. Um, Uncle Anastasia's probably second best, and third best would be Dust, in my opinion. What I found interesting, I always wanted to get Lanigan's book, and I don't know. I listened to the memoir on YouTube. It's on YouTube. It's about 12 hours long, about 40 chapters worth of writing. I assume that's Lanigan's book that I wanted to buy a few years ago. I'm not even sure about that. But it was excellent. Um, but it was quite depressing, I have to be honest, because what he mainly talks about through that book, what he spends the most time talking about, is tracking down drugs and doing drugs and selling drugs, hardcore drugs, not weed. You know what I mean? Crack, heroin, cocaine, etc. But let me start with this. I never really knew the dynamic between the people in the group. And by that I mean the main three, which were the Connor brothers, um, Lee and Van, I believe were their names. Two very big fat guys, 6'4", huge dudes. And how it all started, I never really knew. And what surprised me when I first heard about Lanigan's book back in the day, a few years ago, was how he talked about some of the guys in the group, how he just kind of really dissed them. I was kind of surprised by that, the level of shit talking that was going on, because I never knew it was like that. And the way it all started, if memory serves, is Mark Lanigan came over to the Connors' house because they all lived in the same town when they were very young. He knew them as children, you know, he saw them. And eventually they hung out at some point when they were older teenagers, I believe. And while Lanigan was having dinner with the family there, the Connor's mother said, "Hey, have you heard Lee's songs?" And Mark was like, "No." And so she yelled for Lee, and Lee was basically like, "What the fuck, mom? Leave me alone. Fuck off. What do you want?" One of those kind of deals. The Connors were spoiled kids. They had a little bit of money and a business, and they were kind of spoiled. So that was the attitude Lee Connor had. Like, what the fuck do you want, mom? So anyway, the mother convinced Mark to go in the room with Lee and listen to Lee's songs that he had been recording. And Mark was kind of impressed by what he heard. Now, before I go into the rest of that, let me give you a little bit of backstory on it. Lee's brother Van and the other guys in the group came to Mark and said, we don't want Lee in the band anymore. We want you to join the band and be the singer or something. Take some role in the band. We don't want Lee in the band anymore. So that was the initial, I guess, impression they left on Mark Lanigan. Mark didn't know why. He didn't understand why they didn't want Lee in the band. So anyway, back to where I was. So the mother convinces Mark to go in the room with Lee and listen to his songs. Mark's impressed by what Lee has done. Mark was impressed with Lee's ability to write cohesive music. And Mark realized, hey, wait a minute, this is the guy with all the talent and all the ideas. Why the hell don't the other guys and his own brother, Van, why don't they want Lee in the band anymore? He didn't get it. And he actually kind of liked Lee a little bit in his ability and the songs. So Lanigan went back to the other guys, Lee's brother Van and the other guys, and basically said, why don't you guys want Lee in the band? It seems like he has all the ideas. Like, what are you doing? You need to stick with this guy, Pretty quickly after that, though, Mark and Lee started not getting along, and Mark realized, okay, I get it now. Lee's basically an asshole, and he's impossible to get along with, and he wants to control everything. How many times have we heard this before? Someone in a band that wants to control everything and kind of ruins everything. So they kept Lee in the band, and they formed their band and went from there. They did, 4 or 5 albums that really gained no traction. I've heard some of those albums. One of them is Buzz Factory, and they have some good songs on it, and it sounds like the Screaming Trees. They never really changed much, in my opinion, throughout their whole career. And that's one of the things I liked about them. And I got to say this about Lee. All the different fights him and Mark and the other guys had over the years, Lee does seem like kind of an asshole, but we've seen this in other groups. Axl Rose is kind of not kind of an asshole. He's a total psycho asshole for what he did to the other guys and how controlling he was. Billy Corgan are good examples of this. And as big of assholes as they are and psychos as they do have real talent. That's the thing. Axl Rose, no matter what you think of him as a man, is a tremendous, or was a tremendously talented fucking singer. I've always thought that. Billy Corgan can't sing for shit, but he can write any song and he can play any instrument. And he's a good songwriter. Clever. I love Smashing Pumpkins as well. Never for Corgan's singing, but for his ability to write amazing songs. The guy is talented. You can't take that away, even though he's a control freak psycho. And as for Lee Connor, as much as people disliked him and as big of a psycho or control freak or spoiled kid he was, in my opinion, he was the talent in the band. He was the guy that created the sound. And I was listening to Screaming Trees today, and I just, that guitar sound that he created is just so cool. It's not super heavy, if that's what you're into. I like heavy bands. I like lighter bands, all kinds of shit. That's not what it's about. It's not a super heavy Nirvana type sound or something. It just has this quality to it that's just really nice. It just, I don't know how to explain it, but it's a very unique guitar sound and band sound that the Screaming Trees have and had. And in my opinion, that's because of Lee. Lee was, in my opinion, the brains behind it. He wrote the stuff. And for those first 4 or 5 albums that the Screaming Trees did that really didn't sell well, and didn't really gain any notoriety for them, Lee came up with basically all of it. He even wrote the lyrics, and Mark would complain in his memoir that he didn't really like the lyrics that Lee wrote. He thought they were too soft, not edgy enough. And I find that interesting because of how well that Mark Lanigan sang them. So for those first 4 or 5 albums, it was basically, the rule was Mark had to sing what Lee wrote. Mark couldn't write his own stuff. And they ran with that because I guess Lee was impossible to deal with. And some of those early albums are good. I've heard some of them, like I said. Buzz Factory is one of them. Now, when they got to Sweet Oblivion, which was their first like major label, their first big chance at an album that could really reach people. And of course, they got one of the songs from the album on the single soundtrack, which is invaluable. Remember with Chris Cornell, Chris talked about how he got Billy Corgan's Smashing Pumpkins song on that album. He got Billy an opportunity to have one of his songs on that single soundtrack. That was invaluable, in my opinion, for the Screaming Trees especially, and the Smashing Pumpkins especially. My personal opinion is millions of more people found out who the Smashing Pumpkins were and who the Screaming Trees were because of that singles album, that movie soundtrack. Pretty much everyone knew who Soundgarden and Pearl Jam was by that point. But not Smashing Pumpkins and Screaming Trees. A lot of people didn't know about them, including me. I didn't know about the Screaming Trees. So I cannot state hardly enough how important the Screaming Trees getting their song Sweet Oblivion on, or Nearly Lost You, whatever it's called, on that singles album. It catapulted their reach. So when they got to the point where they were recording Sweet Oblivion, that album, the one most people know, Mark basically went in the studio and said, I'm writing my own lyrics this time. Fuck off. I don't care. Blah, blah, blah. And for some reason, Lee and his brother Van and the rest of the band were like, okay, whatever you want to do, man, whatever you want to do. I guess they were all excited that this was their big chance. I don't know. There was a change in attitude. So Mark wrote, according to him in his memoir, most or all the lyrics for Sweet Oblivion. And then their next album, Dust, or their final album. I can't remember if they did one after that. Mark wrote the lyrics for Dust and Sweet Oblivion, pretty much. And I really didn't notice that much difference in the lyrical style of those 2 albums and the earlier albums, but whatever. They're 2 incredible albums. So that's pretty much what the dynamic was. Now, what I realized from this memoir, which was kind of depressing, now that the music kind of side is out of the way, what Mark spent most of his life doing from the time he was a teenager to, I believe, 33 years old was, again, finding drugs, doing drugs, getting money off of people, scamming people, lying to people, stealing things. He was not a good guy. And I'm someone that's a huge Mark Lanigan fan and Screaming Trees fan saying this. I'm not saying this to diss him. He said as much in his own book. He's described himself at the end of the book and all the things he did wrong. That's what was surprising to me. Because for me, Mark Lanigan is that tall, good looking, red haired dude, long hair in the Sweet Oblivion video with the wind in his flowing red hair. And Mark Lanigan to me is the guy that played with, the Queens of the Stone Age, even though he looks a little run down by that point. When you look at these guys perform on stage, you wouldn't think, and I can't say all musicians are this, but a lot of them were. You don't think they spend 90% of their day seeking out drugs, selling drugs, taking drugs, a kind of degenerate lifestyle. You don't, that doesn't, when you see them up on stage, that doesn't come into your mind. Now, for me, every time I hear a Mark Lanigan song, this is what I got stuck in my mind now, unfortunately. But it's the truth. And I'd rather know the truth, I guess, than just run with the not true fantasy. As far as these guys go, Chris Cornell as well, we discovered some things we probably would have rather not discovered when we looked into his life and the lives of certain people around him. And I guess what I'll do is I'll just give a few examples of what I'm talking about that was kind of disappointing and kind of, blows the fantasy all to shit. The one thing that really surprised me was even during and after creating Sweet Oblivion, that album, Creating Dust, Mark Lanigan was selling crack out of his apartment, like full time. That's really what he was doing. In other words, what I'm trying to say is he was more of a drug dealer and drug taker than a musician, because that's what he spent most of his time doing, not writing songs, etc. He kind of wrote the songs on the fly right before the recording process and stuff like that. So yes, he was actually cooking up the crack in his apartment. And there were points where his electric was turned off, his phone was turned off, he didn't have a car. He basically had a pager, not even a cell phone, a fucking pager. And he would run to this payphone that was, blocks away from his apartment. An apartment, by the way, that had, piles of needles on the floor. And he would often let other drug addicts stay there. And what he would do is he would use these drug addicts as employees to run his crack out to people and do all the things he didn't want to do. And eventually, in the town he lived, a cop wanted to know about a certain laptop that ended up in a pawn shop. I guess it had been involved in a crime. And the cop didn't show up at his door because he was looking to bust Mark Lanigan for being a drug dealer, even though everyone in town knew it. The cop was there about the laptop. And Mark explains how when the cop knocked on his door and said, "You better let me in. I need to talk to you. You better let me in." This guy was serious. He was not fucking around. So the cop comes in his apartment. He sees piles of needles on the floor. I'm talking 2-foot high piles of needles, stuff like that. This is the way Mark describes it. Heroin paraphernalia on the table, because before Mark let the cop in, he dumped some drugs down the toilet. But he didn't have time to really clean up the place, obviously, when you've got a 2-foot high pile of needles laying on the floor. He had one of his drug employee friends sleeping in the other room on a mattress on the floor, and there was all kind of drugs and paraphernalia around there. An actual cup full of balloons of heroin and stuff. Cop wasn't interested in any of that shit. He wanted to know about this laptop. And the cop basically told him at the end of the conversation, he's like, "I'm not here to bust you for whatever the fuck you're doing here. But you got two choices, man. You either go to rehab or get the fuck out of town and never come back. So Mark decided to go to rehab. He lasted about 5 seconds and escaped out the back window of the rehab. And then he became basically kind of a transient. His whole operation had gotten fucked, his drug dealing, little crack dealing endeavor there. And he ended up working for two other drug dealers. Now he was the employee, sleeping on their couch. 2 different times, 2 different guys. And what ended up happening there is eventually he would get spooked for some reason and think he needs to move on. And he would, what the supply of drugs the dealer would give him to sell that day, he just left and never came back. And the second time he did this, the second guy he did this to was a real serious dude. So Mark ended up at this 4 young guy's house from his hometown. He was staying there. It's a big 3-bedroom or something house. And the guy showed up there, and Mark couldn't figure out, how the fuck did this guy find me? The second guy he ripped off. And he knew Mark was there, and the guys that owned the place or lived at the house basically were lying and said, no, Mark's not here, and you can't come in. And they stopped the guy from coming in. So Mark had to sneak off because he didn't want to endanger the 4 or 3 guys that lived in the house any further, these young guys he knew. And before I go into the next part, let me just say this. For years, he was doing crack and heroin every single day. Every single day. And he developed this way where he could take a hit of crack, hold it in, and shoot the heroin at the same time. This is just the tip of the iceberg stuff I'm telling you here. You need to listen to this memoir if you're interested. It's horrifying, the life he was living. And it doesn't sound fun. And it doesn't sound romantic. And it doesn't sound like, you know, some great rock star fantasy. It sounds very miserable, very lonely, even though he slept with tons of women and did a bunch of other shit. Everything got ruined because of his addictions. Any relationship, anything he had going in his life, just everything got ruined because of these addictions. And again, before I tell you the last part after he left these 3 guys' house he was staying at, I want to tell you one drug story of him. He was in Amsterdam or England. I can't remember which one. He was doing a European tour. Now remember, this guy has a heroin habit. And the thing about musicians traveling around the world doing tours is you can't have a block of heroin on you when you go to England or when you go to Switzerland or wherever the fuck you're going. Canada, there's customs. They check for shit like that. They're waiting for dumbasses to try shit like that. So what a lot of bands and musicians had to do, including Lane Staley, he mentions Lane Staley in his book several times. And Lane was pretty much, sounds to me, living the same life as Mark, except Lane had more money. So it was a little easier for Lane to get his drugs. But Lane was still doing the same type of things. What these musicians would have to do when they go to a new area to do a tour, first thing they get there, they got to score drugs because they're heroin addicts. It's either that or get dope sick. Those are your options. Or get clean. That's never really a good option for a heroin addict, is it? In their mind. So this one story, when he goes to Amsterdam, I believe, I guess the area really doesn't matter if that's correct or not. It's freezing. You're talking Europe in the winter in like November. It's freezing. He's out in the middle of the night after, you know, begging someone for money, some band member, merchandise guy, something on his tour with him. because he never, that's another thing about him. As well as these albums did, this couple albums, the more famous ones they did, the guy never had any money. He was always out of money. He was always bumming money off of other people to buy drugs, and everybody knew it. But, you know, he's a famous singer, so. So he's walking in the freezing cold, wearing pants, you know, he's been wearing for clothes he's been wearing for weeks or days, because his bag got lost or something. And he's freezing his ass off. He's withdrawing from heroin. And it's hard to find a dealer because it's so fucking cold out. He knows the area of town you go to get drugs like this. In any country he goes to, he pretty much already has these areas scouted out. They're all terrible ghettos. You're risking your life doing this. That's the thing. Again, musicians that go to these new areas, they're going to the harshest ghettos in these cities. You're risking your life. Forget about the drug addiction and you might overdose or whatever with that shit. You could get killed. You get stabbed, shot, whatever. Anyway, he goes to the ghetto in Amsterdam, wherever the fuck he was, and he buys a bulk amount of heroin for a few $100. When he gets back, remember, he's in deep withdrawal at this point. He needs the shit now. That's the major theme of the book, him being dope sick and fighting the odds to find some heroin. That's, again, the depressing part of the book. And he goes into such detail about these excursions. So when he gets back to his room after nearly freezing to death, because he wasn't dressed properly, of course, he smells the shit. This is an expert drug buyer, taker. He knows what it smells like, what it looks like. He looked at it before he bought it. Gets back to the hotel. He starts shooting it up. It's not doing anything. It's not getting him high. He realizes he's been fucking played. This isn't real heroin. It's something that smells like heroin, tastes like heroin, seems like it, but it's not. So now he's got this quantity of heroin that is worthless to him, and he's still dope sick. He's not getting better. Now he has to go again. He has to go beg this merchandising guy that's on the tour with him that won't even open the door for him. Very late at night, early in the morning, 3 a.m., 2 a.m., some shit like that. Now he's pounding on someone's door for more money because he doesn't have any to go out and buy heroin again. And there's a lot more details of the story, like not being able to get a ride on the bus and stuff like that, out in the freezing weather, dope sick. The misery of this experience, it's horrible. So he goes back to that ghetto area again, after already having been there and wasted hundreds of dollars on fake shit. He finds a couple guys. He asks them to buy some heroin. A guy walks him around to an alley. Someone else comes up behind him with a knife, puts the knife up to the back of his neck and pushes him against a wall. And he's begging them not to rob him because he's dope sick and he needs this shit to get better. Of course, they don't care. And he said the knife was pressed so hard against his neck he could feel blood trickling down onto his back. So the guys robbed him and ran away. Now he's got no money again. Out in the freezing cold again. Still dope sick. Just robbed. He lies to a cab driver, says, "Take me back to my hotel." Gets to the hotel. Now he's in a fight with the cab driver because he doesn't have any money to pay him. The fight ends up spilling into the lobby of the hotel. The cab driver's very pissed off. Well, the woman behind the desk says, "Mr. Lanigan, I can give you an advance on the card used to rent all of your rooms." He didn't know this. So, of course, he gets a $500 advance. that he wasn't supposed to take, and he pays the cab driver. And this is how he pays the cab driver, with coins that he drops on the floor for the cab driver to pick up. Again, Mark was not a nice guy when he needed his drugs, that's for sure. And it's funny in the story, he's acting like, when he's reading his own words, he's acting like the cab driver is the one who's the asshole here. The cab driver that just got stiffed. And he tried to tell a lie because the cops were about to be called. He tried to lie on the cab driver and say, the cab driver kidnapped me and he tried to keep me in the cab and wouldn't let me go. I told him I just got robbed and I wanted to report this to the police and he's not letting me. He didn't give a fuck about reporting something to the police. He wanted to go back out and get drugs. So he gets his $500 advance on the credit card used to rent the rooms. He goes back out again. Now the sun's about to come up. Early morning. Again, it's freezing fucking cold. He finds a guy. The guy, this is a different guy in the ghetto. The guy walks him back into an alley. Lanigan's looking behind him, making sure he's not going to get robbed again. No one's coming up behind him, but when the dude is about to give him the heroin, what he really does is he grabs, Mark has both hands in his pockets. The thing is, this time he brought a sock full of coins as a melee weapon. He's got it in one pocket. He's got his other hand in the other pocket. The alleged drug dealer grabs Mark's one hand, the one that doesn't have the sock, and tries to get in his pocket and grab his money and run. Well, Mark pulls out the sock full of coins and beats the guy over the head with it. When the guy goes down, he continues kicking him for about 20 minutes and beating him with the sock and damn near killed the guy. So he almost got robbed again the same night, trying to get drugs for, I don't know, the third time. So this guy doesn't have any drugs now. Now he's got to get back to his hotel. But he really needs these drugs. So he's really not trying to go back to the hotel. He's walking around. The sun's starting to come up almost. It's freezing fucking cold. He's getting dope sick. And the way he describes this, the normal routine of Mark Lanigan getting dope sick, is a black, disgusting fluid comes out his mouth from vomiting and out the other end from shitting. This is his life. That's what starts to happen to him and what does eventually happen to him when he gets dope sick, if he doesn't get a hit in time. So he's about to collapse on the fucking ground. It's so cold. And he's still walking the neighborhood looking for a dealer. No one's out because it's so freezing fucking cold. Out of nowhere, some like 6'5" guy on a bicycle that has Tourette's comes riding on a bike in the snow. Mark jumps up and literally stops the guy's progress and asks if he can find him some heroin. The guy has heroin in his mouth and balloons. Guy spits a bag out. Mark explains to the guy how bad off he is. He's like, all right, your hotel's too far. I'll take you to my place. This random heroin dealer or heroin addict picks up another heroin addict off the ground and puts him on the back of his bike and drives him to his apartment. They do the heroin. Mark's better. There's a lot more to that story. You need to hear the memoir, but that's just one example of the lengths he would go and the dangers he had to go through to get his drugs. I find that so sad. And it was very depressing. And these guys, Lane Staley, Mark Lanigan, and others that did this little routine where the second they got to a major city that they were touring in another country or in America, where they would go straight to the ghetto. The most dangerous part of whatever town to buy drugs. Any one of them could have got killed any day of the week. Cobain, Staley, Lanigan, any day of the week, they could have got shot, stabbed, whatever. I'm amazed that didn't happen to one of them. I'm amazed Mark lived as long as he did. It's astounding to me. And again, that's just one drug story. There's a whole book worth. It's frightening, shocking, depressing, degenerate type stuff that I was really surprised at how depraved the lifestyle got. He had Mike Starr at one point show up at his apartment looking for drugs, possibly looking to set him up and get him arrested. So he shut the door in Mike Starr's face. He had Lane Staley's girlfriend fresh out the hospital from some type of heart operation with a goddamn IV bag show up at his door to get drugs the day after her chest was sliced open to work on her heart. And he shut the door in her face because he just didn't want to contribute to that. Terrible stuff, man. Terrible stuff. And Lane Staley stayed at his apartment after his girlfriend died for weeks and weeks, even though Lane had a nice condo somewhere else while Mark was over in Europe on that crazy tour. I find that interesting, that Lane Staley would rather be at Mark Lanigan's shitty apartment covered in needles, and there was another, drug addict there as well that Mark let stay there, rather than his own condo. But whatever. Now, I won't go too far into it anymore. I'll just give you kind of where it ended up. At the very end, I explained in the beginning how Mark needed to leave town because these two drug dealers he had ripped off were after him. That one cop was after him. Remember the cop that said, you better either leave town or go to rehab. He had also heard through the grapevine that the cop was gunning for him. The cop knew he was still selling drugs. He was still in the area, and he was coming for that motherfucker. That cop wanted to take his ass down badly because he didn't listen to what the cop said. So you've got two drug dealers. You've got a police officer. You've got other people in the area that know you're kind of a degenerate thief and drug dealer and liar and criminal. So he has everybody after him. He's burned all bridges. He remembers, at the pawn shop. He knows the people that run the pawn shop. The guy at the pawn shop had told him Courtney Love stopped in there and dropped off this package of information of this rehab for musicians. Mark remembered this. What does Mark really want? He doesn't really want to go to rehab because when the pawn shop guy explained this to him the first time, Mark says, I'm not interested. That's great that Courtney stopped by. That's great that she dropped. I'm not interested in going to rehab. But now he's got to get out of Dodge, and he's got no money and no way to get out of Dodge. So he decides to go back to the pawn shop, say, hey, do you still have that thing that Courtney dropped off? I want to go to that rehab now. They arrange a plane for him. It's paid for. His plan is once he gets off the plane, I believe in California, once he gets to California from where he is, I'm just going to dip and buy drugs and start this whole process over again. Start selling, just be a transient on the street like I was. That was his plan. When he got to California, unfortunately, there was a big security guard waiting for him when he got off the plane to take him directly to the rehab place. So what they basically did with him is they just gave him another drug to knock him out for days and days and days and days. He just slept, maybe ate a little bit, slept for days until the withdrawal phase was over. And he said he was sitting there one day and he said out loud, God, change me. In other words, he had had enough. He was crying out to God, which was very surprising to me because he didn't want nothing to do with God. God changed me. And he said in that moment in his memoir that all he realized just the ridiculous fucking behavior, the way he looked at everything was completely wrong. Him wanting to get back at people all the time for slighting him was just completely wrong. His entire philosophy on life and everything was just completely wrong, and he needed to change. And he said in that moment, saying, God changed me, that this really big event happened in his mind, with his perspective. He felt like something actually took place. And that's not cool, right? It's not cool to invoke God. But he did make sure to qualify it, that, well, I was never really into the Christian God or Catholic God or none of that. He kind of intimated, like, maybe it was a different God and not that God. I don't know, but God. My point is, for a guy like that to even admit that that's what he did, because that's not cool, that's not rock and roll, that's not, enlightened musician type things, talking about God. And explaining that, crying out to God changed my life somehow. I was very surprised to hear that. And the book basically ended like this. He spent a year and a half in different rehab type things. And he had found out that Lane Staley died. And that's kind of where it ended. Now, the thing that bothers me is I know he really didn't want to go to rehab. I understand why he was there. He had some epiphany or spiritual moment with God that changed his perspective and allegedly changed him. What I wonder is, after that year and a half, how clean was he? Did he really go clean? Because the book doesn't, cover any of that. Did he really go clean? Did he go clean a little bit? Did he go back to the heroin? Because I have to be honest, it would be real hard for me to believe that he just stayed clean after that. Because I'm not even kidding here. I'm not joking. I'm not trying to be funny. About 80% of that book was drug stories. Maybe more. So I really wonder how this all played out after that sobriety period. And he praises Courtney Love because I guess she paid for a lot of it, or dropped the pamphlet off or something. And I wonder what Courtney's motivation with that was. And I'm not going to speculate. I have my own idea on why she did it. But I just thought to myself, does that make up for her killing her husband, allegedly? I don't know. You decide, I guess. I just wonder what her motivation was. And I found the book very interesting, but I'm going to be honest here. I didn't, if you're expecting some great wisdom to come out of this artist, I don't think you're going to find that there in this book. What you're going to find is a brutally fucking honest story. This guy went into the venereal diseases he had, where he shot needles. I mean, he went into very gory, graphic detail about everything. I think he just wanted to just do an honest story about his life. And I don't know if he was trying to put a lesson in there, like, look, at the end, I found God and I tried to clean up. I don't know what the point was, but what I really got out of it, it was just a really honest, gory story, nothing held back, on his life. And I'm never going to look at their music the same way. And every time I hear their music, I'm going to have, I guess, greater insight to really what he was talking about. But man, there were times in my life where I sat, I'm smoking too many cigarettes, I'm smoking too much weed, man. This shit's terrible. What am I, a degenerate? No, uh, what these people are real addicts. Like every thought, you know, every time a tour was announced to this man, Mark Lanigan, his first calculations in his mind, oh, Canadian tour, oh, European, where am I buying drugs? How am I going to finagle buying drugs into this whole situation? That was priority one. And the things he describes, man, that's drug addiction. Him and Staley especially. Cornell, nothing compared to this shit you'll read or hear about. That Staley and Lanigan were doing. So one point I guess I want to make, when you hear anyone say Cornell was a drug addict, well, not like those people. No, he was a fucking lightweight compared to what people like Staley and Lanigan were doing. And that's another thought I had after I listened to this whole Lanigan memoir. I was like, Chris wasn't even nothing near this. When you hear these stories, that's things that Staley and Lanigan were doing, that's, there's no arguing it. That's the depths of drug addiction, the literal lowest fucking rung of the ladder you can get to. Chris was nowhere near that shit. That's what I found interesting. And what I also found interesting, one last story from the memoir. Josh Homme joined the Screaming Trees, the guy from Queens of the Stone Age, to go on tour with them after they recorded their album Dust. Josh knew Mark did drugs all night in the back of the bus, and that was his main thing, and goes out to hunt for drugs. Well, Josh went with him one night, and everywhere they went in the ghetto, everyone thought Josh was a cop, and they almost got killed a couple times, and they got kicked out of everywhere they went. And they got in some real shady, desperate situations. And Josh Homme basically told him on the ride back when they finally gave up, yo, you ever put me through this again, man, I'm going to kill you. So, yeah, that's how dangerous it was. Josh Homme could have died during one of these little excursions. Lanigan could have died. Lane Staley could have died. I'm amazed they all lived as long as they did. It's incredible. Anyway, I have to go. My phone's overheating. Have a wonderful evening, wonderful Christmas if I don't talk to you before then.